Hello, everyone. Good morning. My name is Rich Sloma. Welcome to today's New York State Archives presentation of Preserving Collections with Limited Resources. Today's presenter is Cher Schneider. Cher is the head of conservation for the New York State Education Department, Office of Cultural Education. This session is being recorded and will be available for future viewing. If you have any questions during the presentation, please type them in the chat box to the right of your screen, and we will answer them at the end of the presentation. And at this point, I am changing Cher's role to presenter. And Cher, if you're able to, you can take it away.
Okay, great. Hi, and thank you all for coming. I have a lot of slides to get through, so I wanted to give you as many resources as possible. So my goal is to help you to become empowered to preserve your collections with limited resources. And what do I mean by that? I mean that you probably have a collection or collections that need preservation under your care, but you have limited amount of staffing perhaps, or limited amount of funding. And so I'm coming at this as if I were working with you and giving you as much resources as possible, because a lot of you do not have preservation or conservation staff probably working with you. First question I always get is, how do I care for my collection? And collections vary in all types of media. So the biggest recommendation that I always, coming to me for conservation, the first thing that you need to do is to have intellectual control of what you have, which is always problematic in every institution that I've been in, whether walking through for assessments or actually working with, and each department works differently. And then the second, then you can focus on your preservation plan. And what I want to tell all of you, I'm going to be, do not reinvent the wheel. What do I mean by that? One of the most important things I can say is there's a lot of advice and grant-funded resources out there online, and I put a lot of that in this presentation. So I want you to utilize these resources because you do have limited resources. And these are all resources that I always advise on and that I use myself. And so that I hope that you find these very helpful as we go through. So what do I mean by intellectual control? For me, you need to really locate where all your collections are. A lot of times supplies, collections, and even trash may be kind of integrated into one area. You want to make sure you can identify the different medias that you have. You want to organize your collections, perhaps by media, perhaps by collection. Sorry, I had to cough. And then you want to make sure that you have your information collected so that you can track your collections, loan them if you need to, exhibit, etc. Very important. When I go into collections, especially for assessments, usually when you first walk into a collection, you will see piles of things. This may be typical for you, it may not be. There's constantly gifts and donations being given in. And what I can say is that you need to make sure that you can separate out your collections. And why do we want to separate out and identify our collections? Because each of the materials that we have has an environment, temperature, and humidity that is going to be best for its prolonged preservation. If you have something too humid or too dry, you can have catastrophic damage, especially if it's fluctuating quickly or even long term. So you want to make sure that you know what is in your collection. Is it an unstable film, or is it a newer film that is going to be more stable? And this will have a huge impact on how you collect your materials, where you place your materials. But I find that in my experience, a lot of collections may not know all of the different types of materials they have, so they can't best preserve it because they're not sure what environment they need to provide. Couple of resources, because my expertise is in paper. There's always a lot of questions about photographs and digital prints. And so one of the great resources that's out there, if you haven't seen, is Graphics Atlas. And this is from IPI. It was a grant-funded research. And they actually provide identification for different types of photo processes. You can see these processes, compare them side to side. If in different lighting situations, you can actually see a cut sample from the sides to see the different layers, and it helps you identify those. Another great resource is the DP3, which is the Digital Print Preservation Portal. And again, this is through IPI, and more and more this is becoming very typical. We're seeing a lot of digital prints, a lot of paper coming from inkjets and things like that, and how do we identify them? What kind of different deteriorations are happening to them, and how do we preserve them? This is something that's going to be more and more pertinent as we go forward, especially in the digital world. So the third step I like to talk about is organization. I talked about, separating out trash, empty boxes from your collections. This was actually, the large images is something that I did in-house recently over a couple-hour period in a collections area so that we could determine we don't need all these empty boxes or trash. The other thing you might want to think about is putting like items with like items. If you have small, loose items, you can put them together in a box or you can bag them. The goal is not to be confused, to organize things, and not to lose anything at all. On this slide and throughout the presentation, I'm going to have a slide for select institutions, select vendors, select suppliers, and these are all suppliers that I actually use and purchase from. And so that I hope that you find them useful. You can buy boxes, you can buy mylar sleeves, foam for inserts, tools, equipment, all kinds of things. The last in the process would be information management. This is not my specialty. However, I work with people whose specialty this is. And so for me as a conservator, thinking about the preservation, I really need to know what is coming through, what everything is so that we can track it, We know we identified it. We know what the media is now. And so for smaller institutions or even larger institutions, sometimes this can be as simple as a Word document or an Excel file up until a complex, database system. And every step of the way, there needs to be tracking of these items going in and out of your institution, throughout the institution. And so this is really important part of it. And I would say the last part of it also, when you organize whether you're going to archive or destroy the item, I think seems to be a hard part in archives, but I think it's an important step to understand that we can't collect everything, and maybe everything should not be collected, especially when we're talking about the preservation of the collection. Remember, you are the curator of the collections. One resource I would say, if you haven't heard of Lyrasis, you probably have. Working in archives, they have archive space, they have collection space, and you can purchase this, I believe, archive space for as little as $300 a year for a smaller institution. So if that's something you're interested in, you can actually contact them and get a lot of consulting. You can get free advice from them. They're really great. I've worked with them through multiple institutions. Here in New York Archives, we're actually switching over to archive space. So I know that the folks in the archives could actually speak about that and help you along that way also. So now we've got intellectual control. So now we can really focus on the preservation plan. And just remember that your institution, your preservation plan may look different. This is the preservation plan I have come up with for my institution, taking into consideration what the environments are, who my staff are, and what kind of abilities we have within, what kind of collections we have. So just remember that this may not look exactly the same, but this is my example, and yours may vary slightly, and that's okay. And just remember, it's going to grow and change as your institution grows and changes also. So one resource that I want to recommend is the American Institute for Conservation. They have loads of resources. This is our, professional committee that we join for conservation, and we have events, we have resources, we have conservators, but I recommend they have a specific, it's called CAP, which is Conservation Assessment Program. They have people, which CAP assessors, that you can get grants for to come out and look at your building, which is called a preservation assessment. And so you can actually look at the building, they will look at your collections, and they will give you a very detailed and large report on what you can do towards the preservation and changes that you can make for your institution. The next resource I'd like to recommend is DIPSNY, which is the Documentary Heritage and Preservation Services. You can also contact us here at New York State Archives to get you in touch with them, but they have multiple resources. They can help you with planning and assessment. They can help you with grants, how to write grants, things of those natures. So there's just tons of free resources from them, especially for New Yorkers. So what do I mean about environment? So particularly for my building, it's huge. It was not meant for collections, and there are collections in every crevice of the building that you can imagine. This is an example of facilities architectural floor plans. that are in our building, and I walk by and say, oh, this is not a place I usually am, but this is something I need to take care of. So you want to focus on the large impact, the biggest bang for your buck. So you want to think about a preservation plan as a bubble. So you start on the outside and work your way in. And that's kind of why I built it that way. So the best thing you can do for the preservation of your collection is keeping everything in a good and stable environment. And what does that mean? That means that differs for every institution, right, depending on what your collections are. And that's why it's so important to identify what the materials are. So there are a few resources that I would like to recommend. There's a new company out there who does environmental monitoring and integrated pest management for preservations, museums, libraries, archives, any institution. They started in 2018. You can start with them with a 3-minute survey, and you can actually talk to a conservator who will help you and guide you along the way. Probably a bunch of you are aware of eClimate Notebook. This is from IPI, and they have different levels of subscriptions that you can use. So their data, like Conserve, analyzes and tells you what kind of risk you have for your specific collections, what you can do then. Maybe you need to move a collection into a different area of your building, or maybe it's good where it is, and maybe you just need to lower temperatures or something to that effect. But it's really good resource out there. For us, we do have integrated pest management that is done by an outside firm, but we also do it inside. I recommend for everybody to do it in-house. You can do it very low cost with sticky traps, and then you monitor the activity at least on a monthly basis. So the idea of IPM, or integrated pest management, is to mitigate pest activity without the use of harsh chemicals. And this museumpest.net is a great pest list, actually, which people from all over the U.S. will send in pictures and get free advice about what it is in your collections. Is it dangerous to what you're collecting and what's in your institution? And they have images, and so I definitely recommend this as a free resource. So there are some select suppliers in which I recommend. So I didn't talk about the actual collecting of the data, but those are called data loggers, in which you can purchase hygrothermographs or data loggers from a variety of these retailers. The other thing I would recommend is a lot of larger institutions have gone digital at this point, and so I would recommend starting off, you may want to get small digital, but just remember that everything needs constant maintenance, so things will get out of calibration. And so if you want the good old hygrothermographs with a drum, you just need to replace the paper, a battery, and a felt tip pen very, monthly, sometimes every few months. But a lot of larger and older institutions have gone digital, and so I haven't tried it myself, but I would recommend, asking for donations of these old hygrothermographs, because a lot of times older institutions can't sell things, but they can give things away if you can pick them up for free. So that's kind of what I would recommend. The next level for me in OCE is education and training. And so for me, I am currently a staff of 1, and I have a huge collection. And so there are lots of other staff in the building. So how do I help preserve the collections? I help preserve the collections by training those around me to understand what goes into the preservation of the collections and their particular collections. So for me, education and training is a free way in which I can kind of give myself more hands throughout the building by educating and training the staff that is around me. You know, if you are a staff of 1 in, say, a historic house, you know, education and training, you can do a lot of free things online. The 3 things that I recommend is the care and handling of your objects that are in your collection, you know, understanding the environment and how HVAC systems work, and then identifying the collections that you have and the materials that you have. And these are all webinars that you can get for free online. A great resource made by the University of Illinois in Champaign-Urbana, Illinois. It's called the PSAT, which is the Preservation Self-Assessment Program. This is for mostly smaller institutions, but it can be larger. It helps you to identify your materials in your collection. You can create surveys and assessments, which will tell you environmental guidelines towards those particular materials and the optimal storage conditions and the types of storage that you should be keeping your materials in. It also helps with preservation planning. So this is a great free resource that you can sign up and use. IPI, again, they are the people who do the research and set guidelines for us, and they are located in Rochester, New York at RIT, and they have all kinds of free resources, which I've already given you, the DP3 and the graphics atlas. They have a ton of free webinars. They will come out and do webinars. They do environmental assessments and preservation planning. So they are a great resource to contact out to. You know, think about state and local government agencies. As New York State Archives, part of our mandate is to educate New Yorkers on, you know, everything that goes into archives. And in my case, it's about preservation and conservation. And so the National Archives and Records Administration, this is what their website looks like. But if you go scroll all the way down to the bottom at the left, there is a preservation tool, which you wouldn't normally see unless you're looking for it. And then under there, they have all kinds of preservation strategies and programs. They have educational resources. They have professional development of all sorts. So NARA is a great resource to have for us in preservation. And they set the standards for a lot of state agencies. I gave a whole list here of select institutions. Of course, all of the regional labs, which I will talk about, the Getty Institute. The one thing I want to talk about in education and training and collections care, preservation, I know we're talking about the archives, but I want to say with preservation and conservation that this isn't limited to archives. So there's a lot of cross-pollination between archives, library, and museum when it comes to preservation. And so I recommend stepping out of comfort zones and actually looking towards other networks where you can gain some more free information. So collections care for me in my institution will include housekeeping, storage, exhibits and loans, disaster planning, and in your case, in the smaller institution, it might be integrated pest management. So what do I mean by collections care? We want to mitigate mold, pests, soil. These are all things that are going to destroy your collections, and we want to make sure that they don't come into our collections. And so collections care is a simple way to mitigate damage or to prevent it. So before preservation, most conservators were trained in preventative conservation is what we call it. And at this point, you've already taken care of the environment, so your temperature and humidity in your environment should already be taken care of. And so that is also that extra step that we take for that. You want to make sure that you're walking through your buildings and collections regularly. You want to make things such as housekeeping, dusting, vacuuming on a routine basis. And then you want to walk through and find out what you can do at low cost and what can be done with your limited staffing. And I will tell you that if you call and network, there are people out there such as myself that will give a lot of free information and advice or consult with you. One of the recommendations websites I recommend is called Stash. It is storage techniques for art, science, and history. So this is written by professionals in the field. They actually did a health index survey that said 89% of institutions did not have adequate storage facilities. I can tell you from working in many different institutions, that is correct. Many of us have institutions or buildings that are old. They were not meant for collections. They were not meant to keep a stable environment. Historic houses, they were somebody's house. Things are old. Things are not breaking down, things like that. So 65% of these people also reported that damage is actively happening from their improper storage. It really is a wake-up call. So Stash is made for all size institutions, and it can be a great resource just to help you understand what types of storage and improvement for storage there is out there. The Library of Congress has a really great collections care page that has a bunch of information on different types of especially paper-based collections that I recommend that you go out and you read all of these websites and just spend some time on them and learning, and just keep them as resources for you. If you haven't already, this is the National Park Service. This is an oldie but goodie. If you haven't heard of conservograms, make sure that you doc this page or save this page, because there are at least 22 types of listings, from disaster response to collections care to exhibits to packaging. There are so many resources. Some of these are old, some are newer, but they are still relevant. And they are step by step and put out in kind of a grid fashion that makes them really easy to use and follow. And so it is an amazing resource from the National Park Service. So I'm constantly asked about collections care because we talk about disaster response, disaster planning, and recovery. Up here in upstate New York, we have an Alliance for Response, which is a subsidiary of AIC, which is the American Institute for Conservation. I recommend that you join this group. You go, recently they had a how to create a disaster plan, and it was a 6-month workshop. So you could do a step-by-step, get an outline. So I recommend you use them as a resource. There are 2 disaster response companies, one being Polygon. They work directly with paper products. So they do disaster response and recovery. They have climate-controlled storage, and they can also do digitization. I recommend that the companies out there for disaster responses, they can work small or large, but get to know them, have a person that you contact with, have them come out and see your collections. It's really important to make relations with these vendors. The other institution is BMSCAT. I have worked with Polygon and BMSCAT for disaster response and recovery, and they are both really good at what they do. They have professionals. BMSCAT is the larger of the 2 institutions. So I think it's just a matter of, going with who you're comfortable with. But they know what they're doing. They know that what we do is important, and they understand it. So I think that's really the important key, is to make sure that if you are working with disaster and response companies, that they understand that you are a collecting institution and how important your collections are and what's important to you. So with BMSCAT, they do the same thing, disaster response and recovery. They do storage, and they do digitization. I think it's good to also understand that disaster response can be large and it can be small. And so it's good to make those connections. So I have a few contacts for collections care. What I do want to say under these resources is that one size does not fit all. So a lot of these resources that I'm giving you, they may do digitization, they may do collections care, they may do environmental monitoring, but it all kind of goes hand in hand as a preservation plan all works together. A lot of these resources will provide information for different areas in which I'm listing them as. So it's really important to kind of dive into their websites. So the next level that I have for OCE is digitization. Now, this is not my specialty. However, I do work very closely and hand in hand with digitization, as it is considered a preservation service. So I work especially with them with handling and care and advising on different types of equipment. But when I say digitization, what do I mean? Is something too brittle? Is it too valuable that it can't be lent out or used or exhibited? Is it being used often and being damaged because of that? Or is it just simply too large that it can't be used as a resource for researchers. There's many different reasons why you may want to digitize. Is it going on exhibit and they want it for a year or longer? Some really great resources that you may or may not know about. George Blood, he's a provider, or I should say they are a provider of archival audio and moving images and preservation, and they can digitize obsolete formats. So once you talk about digitization, you're opening another can of worms. Just remember that everything else we're talking about something tangible and preserving the object. Now we're talking about creating a whole new object, which is a digital format. And you have to remember that you have to preserve that digital format. And how do you do that? And how do you continue to read it? Color Lab is another resource used in film, Super 8, 16, 35 millimeter. They do processing, printing, scanning, recording, and preservation of the film. Video, they will digitize, they will make master copies, and they can do conversions and preservation also. And Scene Savers is another one that I am familiar with. They can do film, video, and audio. They can do restoration and transfer, and then digitize. They can also scan slides and still images. They will provide consulting and assessments on storage and hosting also, which is a little different than the others. So this is from ALA. A part of that is the Digital Library Federation. And so what I would recommend is that you join. They have groups, and so they have kind of project management and digital preservation. And I have just learned a ton as a conservator about the processes, networking, who to contact, and I just found that these groups to be a really amazing resource to be a part of. Here are some listings of digital services. So one of the things that I would recommend is that, you know, all of the regional labs, which I'll touch upon in a minute, are really great resources for digital services. But there's also universities, historical societies, sometimes public libraries, in your areas that may actually provide. I know in Cleveland, like the public library has a whole floor dedicated to digital services for the public, and they will actually host those digital services that they provide. So there are things out there. So I say call your local institutions, and they may be able to guide you if they can't help you there. So last but not least is conservation. And so usually when people come to me, they think about preservation, conservation comes to mind. But that is usually the last in the preservation plan because it's expensive. People tend to not have the money or the staffing or even the space. So that is really the last on your list. Once you get the environment under control, which will preserve your collection, you've trained staff and yourself, everything has been boxed up and organized, and You may have done digitization of items that are in need of repair and cannot be safely handled. You may have gotten a grant for a project to do conservation. Again, here we are at AIC, which is, again, American Institute for Conservation. There are different levels in conservation. Some are trained conservators like myself who went to school and got a master's degree. Others are trained in the field. That is less and less likely, but there are people out there who call themselves conservators, but they are not. So I definitely recommend to be careful and wary of who you are contacting. But if you go on to AIC, there are peer-reviewed conservators such as myself who hold the title of fellow, and they will be listed under Find a Conservator in your area. So you can look by area and you can look by discipline, which is type. So if we have a book and paper, there's textiles, there's electronic media, paintings, photographs, and there are even scientists if you're looking for something like that. I talked about the regional labs, so I'm going to talk about in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, there is CCAJ, which is Conservation Center for Art and Historic Artifacts. Again, they are multifaceted, so they have conservators on staff that do book, paper, and photographs, but they also do education and training. They help with assessments and surveys. They do digitization, so the regional labs really do a variety of things and can help you out with. And I'm sure DIPSNY is a part of them, and so they also are great as a resource just to contact if you are confused about where to go, where to start, what to do. The next regional lab I want to talk about is NEDC, which is Northeast Document Conservation Center. They are located in Massachusetts above Boston, and they focus on book, paper, photographs, and Asian art. But again, like CCAJ, they also do education and training. They do digitization. They can do audio preservation, assessment, surveys. They also have a course on preservation training, which I think is a really wonderful resource. They also have a lot of resources out there on disaster planning. ICA is Intermuseum Conservation Association, located in Cleveland, Ohio. And they are a little different in that they have paintings, objects, textiles, and they are in the process of hiring a paper conservator at this time. And just like NEDC and CCAJ, they will do education training, surveys. They actually will help with large installations and packaging, digitization. So they're also a really great resource because they have a host of conservators on staff. There are more regional labs, but we're going to start getting more west, so I'm not going to talk about them. And now I'm just going to do a few quick images of conservation treatments, and we can get to some questions if there are any. So we talk about conservation. This is a before and after, before on left, after on the right. This, is probably, I think this was a 60-hour treatment where, surface cleaning, adhesive and tape removal, washing, mending it back together, and aligning. So when you're talking about treatment, things can get very expensive very quickly. And the one thing I do want to recommend is that if you are working with a conservator, you have the final say and nothing should be done without you as the collection owner. You should be getting images before and after, sometimes during treatment, and all kinds of written documentation when you get your item back. But, you know, you're probably looking at thousands of dollars, if not tens of thousands of dollars for a treatment such as this. I would say probably about, you know, somewhere in between about $6,500. This is a engraving with a really bad tide line. This treatment took about 45 hours. This was for archives. The other thing I would say is if you do spend money on conservation treatment, I would recommend thinking about having this stored in such a fashion that you may be able to exhibit it if that is something that your institution is into. Such as this, it was put into a mat with a cover so that they could just fold back the cover and then display it after conservation treatment. It's not that much more, but once you have it done, that's kind of it, and you don't have to worry about it, and it can be exhibited or loaned as needed. This is a tin type that was actually done here at OCE. The hinge had failed and someone had taped it together. When you're talking about simple conservation treatments, there is not a lot that I would recommend non-trained conservators to do. However, I do train staff to do surface cleaning and mending, but I will say there is no archival tape, even though it may say archival on the box. So thank you. If you have any questions, please contact me or NSA, and we're happy to answer and consult and give you advice on anything that you may need. Happy to take any questions if there are any.
Thanks, Cher. Well, I have let folks know that we can take some questions if anyone has any. So please feel free to field them by typing them into the chat feature. And great tremendous amount of information and great amount of resources, as you had mentioned earlier. So I'm sure that this is going to be something that people can then take with them and use as a reference tool.
Yeah, I'm hoping so. So, you know, if I was walking around with you or working with you in your institution, these are all the kinds of things that I would be talking to you about and giving to you, you know, either in paper form or email, something like that. So I'm hoping that this can be a resource for people. You may know a lot of it, but I hope some of it is new for you.
Emily asks, do you have any suggestions for ways to get supplies at a discount?
Oh, I was supposed to talk about that. So when you're talking about collections care, what I would recommend is making sure that you are kind of providing, you want to set standardized sizes so that you can purchase in bulk. So that way you can get a bit of a discount. And then you just need to retrofit some of the items inside. So if you standardize your sizes, the more you buy, the cheaper they are.
And another question here for you, Cher. So, like, for a small collecting institution, say for like a historical society with a lot of stuff that they've accumulated over the years, any suggestions on, say, good strategies on how to get that initial inventory done? And because, you know, you've got a lot of stuff and you don't have maybe the appropriate containers or even shelving.
Yeah.
Any thoughts on how that can be accomplished?
Again, I mean, you can purchase in bulk some of the boxes and things, I tend to do that in the first initial go through, just to get something organized and you know it's been gone through. I know it's really difficult, but you know, you can only do one thing at a time. But what I would recommend is utilizing free services or low-cost services. So there are a ton of students who need internships. There are volunteers who just love this stuff. And sometimes there are, you know, professionals in our field who have retired and can help out too. So I recommend, you know, AIC and, you know, networking with some of these resources that I gave you, or making relationships with universities and things like that so that you can kind of find the help for low cost, or if there are volunteers in your area. Just remember, whenever you get someone in, there's always a training period. And so that takes up some of your time too. But I know it can be really overwhelming at first, but you just kind of have to decide, you know, there's a lot of job security in what we do because it never goes away. And just remember that you are, you know, picking away at a mountain, but you are making a difference, and that, you know, getting that down in writing, even if it's as simple as an Excel sheet, it's really important to do.
Okay. Let's see, got a question here from Emily. A question here, I think it's for local governments or historical repositories clumped together. Can they go in on supply orders together to help get discounts? Is any relationship like that possible?
We do that here at OCE. I don't think this happened in the past, but I'm kind of new in that I work with all three institutions. So I would recommend, if that's possible. I've even worked in areas, say, where, you know, museums or libraries and other institutions would work together and purchase things in bulk in an area. So you might get free shipping, or you could purchase more and then just kind of divvy it out amongst yourself. But within the institution, it really depends on where your budget line comes in. I know here the budget line is all the same. So it is possible here. So it really depends on where your money's coming from and then who you know in the area. But yes, I would recommend, if you can, to do that.
Okay.
And oh, and I was just going to say, you know, the prefabricated boxes that come flat and you put them together are way cheaper than trying to build them yourself.
Okay, I have a question here from Maria. What would you recommend for old maps and books, such as cloth and leather covered books?
Cloth and leather covered, it really depends on what kind of condition they're in. You know, if it's an old leather book that may have red rot, we do kind of wrap them either in boards or in paper or even in plastic bags. Leather, you know, depending on the damage of the book, if it's kind of falling apart and needs support, we will support it with wraps and boxes and boards. If not, we leave them be on the shelves. And maps, depending again on space, and we do, every place I'm at, we do end up foldering everything or encapsulating them or having open encapsulations, which are called, you know, L sleeves or even one-sided, just because they tend to be oversized and brittle. It helps with handling. But just remember, cost, you know, there's always ideal and then there's reality. So just remember that it takes up a lot more space when you start adding folders and Mylar encapsulation and cost. but it also helps down the line with the preservation. So if you are going to put multiple things in one folder, just remember that if they are brittle or fragile or have a lot of tears, that movement inside the folder or the encapsulation will create more damage. So things that are very brittle and torn up, they should have their own folders.
Okay, let's see. Question from Georgianne. How expensive is it to conserve a large fabric or paper map that is very brittle and flaking? Like the pull-down maps that we used to have, well, those of us who remember, back in the day in school.
Yeah. So those typically have like a varnish layer on them too. So depending on what you do, and I didn't quite get to the full point of conservation in that you should always ask for options when you're talking about conservation. So just like preservation, because you are one against possibly millions in your collection, hundreds, whatever, thousands, there's only so much you can do with the limited resources. So it's a question of whether you want to just stabilize something. Is it going to be digitized? How much is it handled? Where is it going to be stored? So there's always options on what you can do. So you can do a simple treatment or a stabilization, or you can do a full out treatment. And of course, you know, the more you do, the more expensive it's going to be. So it's really hard to say how much it would cost. But I would say just knowing from the field that most of the regional labs probably charge around $150 an hour.
Okay. Let's see if there's any other questions here from anyone. And while we're waiting, I did want to just let everyone know that if you were watching this presentation in a group of many people, if you could just let us know what that number was, just for us to get a better sense of how many folks were watching this this presentation. So if it's just you, no worries. But if there's 2, 3, 4 of you, that would be helpful. And as I mentioned before, this presentation, the recording, will be available within a few days, hopefully. And you can access that either from the New York State Archives website, or you can go just, if you Googled New York State Archives YouTube, you can go to our YouTube channel as well.
I was just going to mention one more thing about the conservation. The other thing is that if you have images of the item, typically a conservator can give you an idea remotely about what they think the cost may be estimated. Just understanding that it is an estimate, and we do a lot of testing and other things, and sometimes we cannot see the things in images, but in my experience, I've done that a lot.
Okay, I have a question here from Madeline. What would you suggest on how to store historical newspaper books? Enclose them in storage containers, or digitalize them?
Okay. Well, newspapers are not meant to be, they were not meant to be preserved. So they are wood pulp paper, and so they become very brittle very quickly. And typically they weren't stored in great environments, or they were folded up. So if these are already in books, I would definitely recommend you know, putting those books into boxes, because handling is always a risk. Most of the institutions that I've worked at ended up digitizing the newspaper collections. But, you know, how often are they really used? So is it worth the cost to digitize if they're not being used that often? So there's always a dialogue that I have with the curator to find out, what is the best preservation plan for that particular item. Maybe I've come across books where we ended up taking the items apart, taking them out of the book format and then creating them into, mylar sleeves so they end up being flat, because digitizing wasn't necessarily ideal, but they wanted to be able to still have them available for research without damaging them further. So I hope that answer helps. But I just want to remind everybody that my number and my email is up here, and I'm always happy to answer questions and advise.
And I think we have time for one more question. I have a question from Georgianne. What, if anything, can be done with a large cardboard-backed photo that has been stained with cat urine?
Sorry. I don't mean to laugh at your distress, but it's pretty typical. There's always something. So depending on how, cardboard is always an issue when you're talking about photographs, because again, it is wood pulp, it is not archival, and it becomes brittle over time. So again and again, what I see over time is that someone picks up the photograph and then snaps off a corner or cracks it in half or in pieces because of the brittleness. When was the cardboard put on? How was it put on? So is it good to have it on the cardboard? No, but is it integral into, is it a Margaret Burke White where she backed it herself on a particular backing? There's a lot of questions in there as to what to do. As far as the cat urine, I'd make sure, first of all, that it was dried, and you don't want anything sticking to the surface or the recto, the face of it. And then the ammonia smell, I would definitely recommend, putting it, with zeolite boards or putting it in a container with some carbon filters to try and reduce the smell or the odor. But those are the things, and I'm assuming it might not be flat because it got partially wet. So you would want to lay it so that it's not going to, fold up or curl or anything like that. You want to make sure that it's going to try and stay as flat as possible. Yes, it can be pressed even with the board, but there's just so many different things that could be going on that I couldn't realistically advise without actually seeing it. But, it might be able to be taken off the board if it's not original, depending on how it's adhered also. That's something that we do. And one of the images that you see on the bottom image here, that is a debacking that was on very thick cardboard. So I was just, with a scalpel, removing it little piece by piece. So yeah.
And Georgine, just to clarify, she says that it does smell. The urine was on it when they got it, and being familiar with other collecting institutions, sometimes you get things in various states of in different conditions, and you have to then deal with it.
Yes.
And also, just had a couple of questions about people asking about getting copies of the slides. I would say that the handout that we gave you is a fairly large PDF, and that can be enlarged pretty easily. But if anybody really wants a copy of the slides, I can get you a PDF version of the slides. Just send us an email at arctrain@nysed.gov. So that's where you got
the end.
Yep, where you got the instructions for this webinar, or at Rec Management, RECMGMT@nysed.gov, or certainly anybody at the archives, Sherry or anybody at the archives can help you, and we can just get us the word. So at this point, I think this concludes our presentation. And as I mentioned, a copy of this, the copy of the recording will be available, and we will get that word out to everybody as well. So, Cher, any final words?
Best of luck, and just, reach out to your colleagues, use the resources that are out there, and just contact us if you have any more questions or need help with anything. That's what we're here for. So I hope this was helpful, and have a great fall.
Thank you, everybody.